Hi, and welcome to the final series of the Carceral State here at Scuppernong Books. My name is Deonna Kelli Saeed. I am the representative of PEN America here in the North Carolina Piedmont. I am honored to be in conversation today with journalist Phoebe Zerwick. She is the author of Beyond Innocence, The Life Sentence of Darryl Hunt. And today we are going to talk about a part of the carceral country that is sometimes obscured in some of the conversations, particularly what it means like to be innocently convicted and what re-entry looks like. Phoebe Zerwick is an award-winning investigative journalist, narrative writer, and college professor at Wake Forest University. Her work has been recognized by the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University, Investigative Reporters and Editors, the Society of Professional Journalists, Columbia University, and the North Carolina Press Association, and featured in the HBO documentary, The Trials of Darryl Hunt. This book has also been selected for the Southern Book Prize. Voting is through February, and you can vote online at SIBA.com and also at your local independent bookstore throughout the Southeast. Thank you very much. How are you doing, Phoebe?
I'm doing well. We managed to get here safely in this torrential downpour. And I'm happy to be here and to be in this warm, cozy, lovely space.
Thank you. I'm happy to be in conversation.
I'm happy to be with you again.
Thank you. We've been in several conversations before, and every time I come back to this book, there's layer upon layer of intrigue and complexity to the story of Darryl Hunt in so many ways. Every time I come back to it, I learn something new. And I know nothing of the criminal justice system. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have that background. And every time I come back to it, I learn something new. And I also leave with a disappointment in so many ways in how that this happened. That this happened here in North Carolina, and this continues to happen every day. Do you want to briefly frame the story, the origin story, and how you felt called to it?
And that's interesting that you feel you learned something new, because whenever I reread portions of the book or when I was working on it, I kept learning something new. And so I really appreciate this idea of the layers of meaning and all the areas in which the system let Darryl down. So Darryl Hunt was a 19-year-old, very young man living in Winston-Salem in 1984. And he was unemployed, so he was kind of bouncing around, staying with different friends in downtown Winston-Salem. And he was arrested in the brutal murder of a young 25-year-old newspaper editor who was a white woman who was raped and murdered in downtown Winston-Salem. And he was arrested through a series of events that I lay out in the book, but he had nothing to do with this crime. But really, once he was arrested, it was the more I learned about it and the more I thought about it and the more I learned about the system, it was almost inevitable that he was going to be convicted. And so he was wrongly convicted of this crime, and he ended up serving 19 years in prison. And in fact, he was held the wrongful conviction was sustained even for 10 years, even after there was DNA evidence in the case that showed that he was not the rapist. So there was evidence in 1994 that one would think would have gotten him out, and it didn't. And it didn't get him out because once you're convicted, you're no longer presumed innocent. You are guilty, and you have to essentially prove your innocence. And one of the things I really learned by studying this case is that we think we have an appellate court system that's going after the truth, and that's really not what our appellate court system does. What the appellate court system looks at is procedural error. And even when there are opportunities for introducing new evidence, the reviews are still set up for finality. And so every judge who looked at the case after there was DNA evidence showing that he was not the rapist, every judge found reasons or a logical argument that became more and more convoluted and ridiculous to argue away or to excuse away this compelling physical evidence. And so he was still in prison in 2003, and he asked for new DNA testing. And by 2003, we had databases that are now commonplace, but that created the opportunity to find a match. And we had new editors at my newspaper, and I was at the Winston-Salem Journal at the time, and so I was assigned to investigate this case. And we did that, and one of the things I learned, I didn't actually come up with any earth-shattering new evidence, but we came up with a different way of telling the story. And we told it as a narrative with strong characters. And the fact that we told it in a new way helped people see the case in a new way. And we also learned about a rape that had happened after Darryl Hunt was arrested. And I didn't learn enough about it, but I learned that the crimes were very similar, and that became very important in his eventual exoneration, because after my newspaper series ran, the judge who'd ordered testing learned that the state crime lab, because the state crime lab is part of the state, and they're also set up for finality, and they were ignoring his order for new testing. And he threatened to hold the crime lab in contempt of court, and so that got them moving. And then they got a near match, which is meaningless in DNA testing because you need a perfect match. But they got a near match, and it was to a man named, from a man whose last name was Brown. And they got a near match when they tried to match it against the database. And that got the police looking at Brown's family, which included a man named Willard Brown, who was the suspect in that second rape. And so he had been there all along. That second rape had not been fully investigated. And they found that Willard Brown, the police did, and they got a DNA sample from him, and they got the perfect match, and Darryl Hunt was released from prison on Christmas Eve in 2003 and exonerated then a few months later.
You summed that up very nicely, but there's so many other parts of that.
So many parts,
that
yes.
We could spend all night talking about. But wasn't Brown actually picked out from a lineup very early on in the Darryl Hunt case?
He was, and that came out way after Darryl Hunt was exonerated. And it turned out that he had been identified by a witness. He'd also been identified by this other woman who was raped. But by then they had Darryl Hunt, and they did not want to upset or disrupt the prosecution of Darryl Hunt. And so all of that evidence was hidden, and the woman who was raped was silenced, and the witness who identified Willard Brown was silenced. And all of that was to protect the conviction of Darryl Hunt. Well, first the prosecution and then the conviction.
I still have a hard time wrapping my head around this, because again, I'm just the average person who wants to believe that the criminal justice system is fighting for truth. But as you pointed out, its goal is finality.
Yes.
And you talk about also, well, first I wanted to actually go to Darryl Hunt. He consistently maintained his innocence in some of the most eloquent ways throughout the whole time, throughout the ordeal. And also there was no real evidence nor real witnesses putting Darryl Hunt at the scene of the crime.
That's right.
So
there were witnesses, and again, we could go down so many rabbit holes trying to get into all of the minutia of the case. But there were eyewitnesses, but it turned out that they were wrong. And he maintained his innocence from the beginning. And not only did he maintain his innocence, in his actions, he was also innocent. So when he got a second trial, and he was actually also railroaded in another case, all of which is in the book. But he was, after 5 years into the case, he was offered a plea deal, which he turned down. So he was offered a plea deal where if he would plead guilty, they would let him go home for the 5 years he'd already served in prison, and he would not do that. Everybody in his court, all of his lawyers, all the people defending him, there were a lot of ministers involved in the defense committee on his behalf. Everybody, except for one minister, wanted him to plead guilty so that he could go home, so that he could leave prison and begin his life anew. And he wouldn't do it because he wouldn't plead guilty to something that he didn't do, which is extraordinary. And he was a 25-year-old man when he, by his actions, asserted his innocence. Yeah.
Repeatedly.
Repeatedly.
When you did the 8-part series, and when you completed it, did you feel you were done, or was there something else that drew you to this?
Yeah, so I completely thought I was done. And it was, the high mark of any journalist's career, right, to contribute to somebody's exoneration. And then I got to know Darryl, and I left the newspaper, and I landed at Wake Forest University, and I started teaching with his attorney who was running the Innocence clinic at Wake Forest University. And the closer I got to all these people, then I really thought I was done, because in journalism, you think that you don't want to write about people that you know. You want to have this distance. And then in 2016, so a little over 6 years ago, he went missing, and everybody who knew him, including me, was very alarmed about this. And then a day or two later, he was found dead in a truck in a shopping center across from the city's Coliseum. And it was so shocking. And what I know how to do is to pick up a notebook and go and report a story. So that's what I started doing. I was not thinking of writing a book. I was thinking of what happened here. This makes no sense. How could this man who fought for 20 years, who was so strong and so resilient, and was leading a productive life in the 12 years since he'd been exonerated, how could this have happened? And the shooting was pretty soon after that ruled a suicide, and so that made even less sense. And so I started reporting, just initially by going to the scene and trying to find everybody I could find who had seen him in the days before his death. It turned out he'd been silent. Nobody had talked to him in about a week. And that led to a magazine article, which eventually led to this book. And the question sounds simple. I mean, it's a question that journalists begin with all the time, which is, what happened here? What happened? And the answer turned out to be, of course, incredibly complex, because the answer had to do with our history of systemic racism. It had to do with the trauma that Darryl endured, both being wrongly convicted, but also the trauma of being in prison. He was in solitary confinement for a total of about 3 or 4 years of that time, so we now know that solitary confinement makes you vulnerable to all kinds of mental illness and to drug abuse and suicide when you're released. And then reentry was so difficult, and he had people to come home to, but it turned out it wasn't really people, and he had people and friends who understood him, but none of that really helped him heal, it turned out. And he couldn't really find a normal job, and so the work that he ended up doing was advocacy work, which meant that his job became this terrible experience he'd had. So his job became repeating this this story over and over again of what had happened to him. And it all became clearly more than he was able to bear. And his actions, there's so many stories that show what was happening to him that people kind of missed. But for example, he would go to the ATM machine every day. And he did that so that he would have a receipt, time-stamped receipt of where he'd been. So he would always have an alibi. He had panic attacks. And he was quietly abusing drugs. Some of his friends knew and his wife knew. But all the people in the activist world around him in his public life, nobody really knew. People just thought he was quiet, or they thought he was losing weight, but they didn't really know the depth of what he was going through. And that's really what the book is about.
Looking back, you know, he was so involved in re-entry and in supporting people who were coming out of prison. But what do you think would have what could have saved him?
Oh wow, I don't know. I mean, he had a lot of support. He had a deep religious faith. He was a practicing Muslim. But he got a little bit of counseling, but I don't know that he got the kind of counseling that can deal with that level of trauma. His personal life began to fall apart, and there was also this pressure, once he became an advocate and a public figure, there was the pressure of celebrity. He also won a settlement he got compensation from the state, and then he got more money from the city because of this intentional cover-up. And then everybody he knew he had money and thought that he had more money than he had. And so, you know, he felt betrayed by people from his neighborhood, just from his, people he'd grown up with. Suddenly everybody wanted a piece of him, and the public wanted a piece of him. I think if he'd asked for help, but he was a very proud, resilient person, and I don't think he knew. I don't even think he knew what he could do. Basically, where to go.
And he was caught. It seems like he was caught in this particular story of himself, and there was no way out. There was no way for him to be anything.
He clearly
beyond
felt that there was no way out.
Yeah.
And he felt this huge pressure to be a stoic, spokesperson for Innocence. He worked tirelessly against the death penalty. He advocated for what we in North Carolina we have something called the Innocence Inquiry Commission. It's the only state agency in the country that actually looks at innocence as a claim rather than procedural issues. So he advocated for that. He left a really significant legacy. And he also, in Winston-Salem, he founded a foundation to help people coming home from prison with reentry. So he did a lot of one-on-one work. And but I think that was really painful and frustrating for him because he knew what an uphill battle anybody he was trying to help faced because he had experienced it, and he knew that there were so many systemic barriers in place for anybody getting out of prison after they've served their sentence, even if they're exonerated. And he also had a huge heart for people who had committed the crimes that they were punished for. You can see that in his writings in prison, that he didn't believe that anybody deserved to be living in the kinds of circumstances, in the conditions he was living in. So he knew he was innocent, but I don't think he thought he was better than the people who were guilty of their crimes. And so even when he was well, I suppose he was convicted when he was 20, so even as a 20-year-old man, you can, I read entries in his journals where he's talking about nobody should have to live like this. So he had a real heart for people coming home from prison.
I think what's significant about this book is that long-term incarceration is truly traumatic, regardless of if one is guilty or not. And the conversation is the trauma of incarceration really what we want to do in our society?
Yeah, I think that is the conversation. And I suppose I had, until I started researching this book, I was more interested in wrongful conviction and the Innocence movement. And it was really through Darryl's interest in reentry and through some of his friends who I got to know, trying to understand what his life had been like afterwards. And so I spent a lot of time with a couple of his friends who had committed really serious crimes and were now out of prison. And yeah, one of them had committed a rape and possibly another one. And the other friend had served federal time for drug conspiracy. He was a serious drug dealer. He wasn't a user who got caught up and charged with dealing. And watching the struggles that they went through and kind of, not becoming part of it, but becoming close to the kinds of struggles they were going through, just trying to lead a normal life after they'd served their time, really, really opened my eyes to the struggles that we have 600,000 people coming home from prison every year, and several million who have served time but are still carrying the weight of having a criminal conviction on their record. It really opened my heart, my understanding, and maybe opened my heart to seeing what that was like for people.
So there's the trauma of incarceration, and it's truly traumatic, and especially in some prisons is awful. And then the systemic issues of having a criminal conviction, and then there are even, all of these things are compounded then by barriers of reentry.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about some of the barriers?
Yeah. So, we want to think that we're a welcoming society and that people pay their time and then get to come home, right? And there are so many, the barriers. So, who's going to hire somebody with a criminal record? There was this whole movement in this country to ban the box so that employers wouldn't make you check off if you had a criminal record. But everybody checks, and it's easy to check on the internet. It's really hard to lease an apartment. You can't get into most public housing. Most landlords aren't going to rent to somebody with a criminal record, and they can check. There are all kinds of loans you can't apply for. There are different licensing requirements for all kinds of professions that it never occurred to me that a criminal record would prohibit you from becoming, let's say, a barber or a hairstylist.
What?
Yeah, so, I can see why a criminal record would prevent you from working in a bank where you handle money or in a school. But there are all these other kinds of jobs that if you have a criminal conviction on your record, you can't do. Loans, pensions, you might not be eligible for the pension you thought you were entitled to. So people want to get back to work, but it's almost as though it takes somebody who's going to sponsor them, or a stroke of luck that somebody's willing to hire, give somebody a second chance, because most of us don't want to be around people who have a criminal conviction. And then, prison pretty much decimated entire communities. I mean, because there's so many people who, it destroys families. It destroyed Darryl Hunt's family, or his second family, it destroyed his marriage. And so we have whole communities where people have been shattered, where families have been shattered by this experience.
One thing I know was important to you was trying to really honor Darryl's voice in writing this book. And I think you do very well with that. But how did you do this? As a journalist, I think this was probably a little bit different for you writing long form, writing a whole book as a journalist.
Absolutely.
So how did you find a way in to Darryl?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate in that he left his papers to the Wake Forest University Law School archives. So there were several boxes of his letters. There was a journal, and then after he was exonerated, he started recording a kind of oral history, memoir of his life. So there were those writings. There were interviews that he gave. So all of that written material really gave me access to his voice. And then, I would say I relied on his friends for later in the book. I felt that by quoting them and bringing their voice into the story, it was sort of a substitute for Darryl's voice, but it wasn't. It was people close to him who could kind of speak about his experience. But really, it was his journals and his letters and some of the interviews he'd given that allowed me to tell this story from his point of view.
Is there anything that surprised you when you were going through the letters and going through that really took you? Was there something you totally didn't expect?
Well, the first thing that I didn't expect was that anybody who'd ever met Darryl from the time he was 19 years old was impressed by this calm. He had this kind of beatific expression on his face a lot. He was gentle. After he was exonerated, people would remark about that he was charismatic and that he was not angry, or he didn't seem angry. And then when I got into his journals, I mean, he was pissed and he was mad as hell, but he kept all that from other people. So that surprised me. It also was very moving and sad for me that he felt that he had to keep all that to himself. The other thing that surprised me was when I started reading his letters more closely, especially this whole period of time that his case was on appeal and they were trying to persuade some judge that yes, actually it did exonerate him. It did show that he was innocent. The DNA did not match the rape kit. His public demeanor was always so calm, and there was just this growing sadness that I saw in his letters, and this sense of this kind of growing sense of despair that surprised me and was really moving for me. And I suppose the other thing is some of the letters are love letters to the woman who became his wife, and her letters and cards to him, and the depth of how vulnerable he was in these love letters, and how much he loved her, which when their marriage broke up, that's what I knew of before I started reading these letters. What I knew of was that the marriage had not worked, but what the letters showed me was how much these two people really loved each other.
You had mentioned that Darryl, in a lot of ways, was very fortunate when he got out of prison on Christmas Eve. He had a community of people ready to receive him, which is quite incredible, because sometimes people don't have that.
Yes.
Do you want to maybe talk about a little bit about how that initial re-entry went for him?
Yeah. So it was interesting. I talked at the community mosque in Winston-Salem a couple of weeks ago about the death penalty. They had a panel discussion. I was sitting there, and I remembered that the afternoon he got out of prison on Christmas Eve, and there was this whole group of people waiting for him at a Baptist church in Winston-Salem, where they had done a lot of the organizing for his defense committee. And he went to the mosque first, and he went there to pray, and then he went to this church where the place was packed, and he spoke about every single person who had helped him along the way. And so he had his wife. He married a woman from Winston-Salem, April, while he was in prison, and so he had her home to go home to. But it also meant that he left prison and was instantly a stepfather in a home with elementary school and young, I forget how old they were, but middle school and high school age children. So he had a home to go to, but I raised a blended family, and that's a tough situation to walk into, from prison into the role of stepfather.
When your entire adult life, you've been inside.
He was inside, and he craved, more than anything, from the time he was 19 years old. Really from the time he was a child, what he wanted was a family. But even at 19, when he was interviewed by the black newspaper in Winston-Salem, after he was arrested, what he talked about was wanting to get out of prison and get married and have children. He wanted 5 children. And it wasn't his child, but the girlfriend he had before he was arrested had a baby that he thought of as his own daughter, because what he wanted more than anything was to be a father and to have a family.
This case in so many ways touches on so many things, and not only was it a system that consistently failed him in a lot of ways. I think there's a line that someone says, and maybe it was in the HBO documentary, that racism is more important than facts, or
yes, I think Larry Little says that. Larry Little was a city councilman, but who had also been the founder of Winston-Salem's branch of the Black Panther Party. And yes, he says that in the film.
And you see that in this case.
Yeah, you see it entirely. There's another line in the book that's kind of my favorite line. There was a woman who lived in the apartment building where Darryl Hunt's best friend lived when he was arrested. Her name was Estella McFadden, and she just believed that this teenager she knew, that there was no way he was capable of that kind of crime. And when Larry Little started organizing the defense committee, she had the key to a neighborhood church. And so they would meet in the neighborhood church. I don't think she asked permission of the minister, but her view was, I think the way she put it was, when something bad happens, they'll just snatch any black man they can find. They'll just snatch anybody. And so she became one of Darryl Hunt's strongest supporters. She sent him, they're all in the archive, all these Christmas cards she sent him. She sent him a card for everything, and I think she would send him $10 a month, for 20 years. Wow. And she was not a person of means, but she also understood that in prison, like, if you don't have any money, you can't buy snacks. Even a small amount of money really means a lot. Yeah. But I got you off the point. You were you were on to a much more important point than that.
It's fine.
You were on to the point of racism is more important than fact.
That there's racial bias. Just this case was doused with that.
Absolutely. And really, because of the crime, this was... and people had seen this newspaper editor with a black man. So it was a white woman raped and murdered by a black man, and that the idea of that crime, and in most cases the myth of that crime, that's been used since the beginning of history, of our history, since 1619, to perpetuate, first to perpetuate slavery and then to perpetuate white supremacy. So whenever we've wanted in this country to drum up support drum up fear against black people, we've used that myth that the black man is going to rape the white woman. And so that was what was at the heart of this crime. And that's why the more I studied it, that's why I firmly believe that once he was arrested, there was no way he was not going to be convicted.
Yeah. It ended up being another black man who actually committed the crime.
Yes.
And the second rape victim was also a white woman, was instrumental in that. But what this means, and we've talked about this before, is that neither Deborah Sykes or the other rape victim ever really got justice.
Absolutely.
And it is possible, and if I'm wrong, please correct me, but that Willard Brown may have also raped several women, even black women.
He was a suspect in the rape of 2 other white women downtown, and there were a number of unsolved rapes of black women around the same time that were never investigated. Yeah. And he actually was never prosecuted for this second rape that happened after Darryl was arrested. I mean, they were all kind of wrapped into his conviction in the Deborah Sykes murder. But what happened to this other young woman who was also 19 when she was raped on her way to work downtown is that she was manipulated and silenced to protect the prosecution of this black man, so that when it came right down to it, our system really didn't care about a young woman who was raped. It cared more about prosecuting an innocent black man. And she was horribly treated by the police. I mean, they made her repeat the attack in excruciating detail over and over again. They even suggested that maybe she hadn't been raped, even though she was stabbed, I forget, 12, 13 times. She'd been kidnapped and raped in this, what had been a drive-in movie theater. She'd wrestled the knife away from Willard Brown and run naked through the woods to somebody's apartment. And the police, even in those circumstances, said, well, sometimes people make this up. So she was horribly mistreated, and all to protect a prosecution.
In closing, I do want to talk about, kind of to close this series, which has been centered on people writing about the carceral country in various ways, either where it can be people on death row writing or journalists and other writers reporting, being witness to this, which demonstrates that journalists and writers really do have an essential role to play in the stories that we tell about these things. As a journalist, I want you to kind of talk about this, because we are at a point where journalism and the media itself is held in great suspicion in this country.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what journalists can do, well, what people can do for themselves, so the book you're talking about are essays by men on death row. So people can write about their own lived experience. But what journalists can do is go places where the rest of us can't normally go. And whether that's going to your city council meeting to find out what your city council is doing, or whether that's meaning really investigating a case of wrongful conviction and reading thousands of pages of police reports and trial transcripts and going to talk to people. I mean, the average person can't do that. So what journalists can do is look into things and find out what happened. Or we can bear witness to events that the average person can't bear witness to. But yeah, we can answer these very straightforward questions in ways that the average person can't do. Mm-hmm. And you know, there's been a rise of kind of citizen journalism, which has been a very important movement in our country, and also, you know, the rise, we've all got a camera and a video machine, right, and that we carry in our pockets. And so now when there are police murder, because we can say that's what happened to George Floyd now, there's been a murder conviction. You know, there was somebody at the scene who could film that and act in the role of a journalist. And so that's an important force to recognize. But the average citizen, even once they've recorded the video, they don't have the time, or mostly the time, to go and really tell the full story of what happened.
And local journalism is so important. What was critical in Darryl Hunt's case is you, as a local journalist, were able to tell that story because you had a connection to the community, and the community trusted you.
Yes.
And we are now seeing newspapers are shuttering. We're seeing less and less investigative reporting at the local level. And it means that these stories aren't going to be told.
Yeah, so this book was really, in a way, is a work of I'm a local journalist. It's a work of local journalism. So from the original newspaper series that I wrote, that would not, his defense committee tried to get national press interested, but there's 100, not 100 states, there are 50 states, there are 100 senators, there are 50 states. You know, the national press is not going to look into every allegation of a wrongful conviction. Local journalists, we need local journalists to do this kind of work, and we don't have many of them left. Newspapers are a quarter of the size of what they once were. And then this story, his death, that it struck me because I live in that community, and I knew the people who were close to him, and that's what drew me to the story, was being part of his community, and knowing him. One of my favorite memories of Darryl Hunt is that the year after he'd been exonerated, his stepson and my son went to the same elementary school, and I walked my son to work every morning, and I would see him driving his stepson down the hill. He had this bright blue truck, really bright blue, like neon bright blue, and you know, we would wave, and I had the dog and my son, and he that's partly why his death was so shocking, because just that image of him, I mean, it seemed like he was going to go on to make it, and it was the image of a man who was free, who wanted kids. He was being the dad, taking his son to work, to school, and that's sort of an image I carry with me.
Well, why don't we end it on that?
Okay.
Why don't you